Hi, everybody. Welcome to the lecture on pathophysiology, hormone regulation. This is just a brief review. You should have had this in A&P, but there's a lot to it. So I'm just going to kind of hit some things that I think you may have forgotten about. And anyway, but hopefully you have a good background with your A&P. All right, so the endocrine system in general. It's got several functions, and one of the main ones early on is to differentiate reproductive and central nervous systems in the fetus. Okay, so it will play a role in delineating boys and girls and that sort of thing. And then also, as you go on in your life, and as you're younger, it stimulates growth and development. And you all are aware of this. Estrogen and testosterone, you're quite familiar with these very famous endocrine hormones. The other thing that happens is there's the coordination of the male and female reproductive system. I mean, there's growth and development as you mature, both in growth and then in development as you develop into your secondary sex characteristics. But then also, as you are able to reproduce, for women, the ovulation cycle, men, production of sperm is coordinated through some endocrine system activity. The endocrine system is also involved in maintenance of your internal environment in general. It's like directing a lot of traffic, and it will also then respond and adapt to emergency demands that are placed on the body. All right, so here's a picture of it continued. Think of glands when you think of the endocrine system. All right, and so going back to this, you all know about, you might forget about some of these glands in your brain, the pituitary gland, the pineal gland. You have a thyroid gland in your throat area here, and on the back side of it is what's called the parathyroids, which are really 4 little specialized areas of the thyroid gland. It's a separate gland because the cells do things differently. And so when your thyroid has a problem, it doesn't necessarily mean all the cells of the thyroid have a problem. Same with the pancreas and adrenal glands and that sort of thing. It can be specific to a cell type. For example, the pancreas has a little bit more than that, but 3 famous different types of cells, alpha, beta, and these have a different role in managing your blood glucose. Just because you have a problem with the beta cells and you're diabetic doesn't mean your alpha cells are not working. So anyway, just keep that in mind as we go through this. All right, so hormones, you've heard a lot about this. Your parents are probably saying things like, oh my goodness, it's your hormones, you're behaving this way. They do kind of hype you up differently than you might have otherwise felt. So they are communicators of information that your body uses to do things like grow, change, operate, regulate your temperatures, all that stuff. And so they operate with these feedback systems. And there's a standard question that's always asked. It's what's the most common biological feedback? And it's the negative feedback system. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Negative is kind of the balance. It's like it's going to always try to return to normal the condition. So if you imagine all day long your body is regulating your chemistry, it's not just going to go in one direction or you're going to really hit off the wall, right? It's trying to keep you in this state of feedback. Negative is always going back to the middle or to the normal. So you might have to have a little more or a little less, a little more, a little less. Now there's a positive feedback system, and that's pretty much all in one direction. It's amplification, and that's not needed much in the human body, but on certain cases with oxytocin and in labor and delivery to get your uterus to contract, that's an example of, okay, I need more kind of thing. So if you ever ask a question, for the most part, it's the way your body regulates is in a negative feedback loop, and I'll hit that in a little bit more. All right, so some general characteristics of your hormones. They are constructed differently, and that really kind of changes how they move through the body and how they get delivered to a target cell. And so you can have some that are long distance, that kind of that travel a long way, and they hit the target cell, and they're designed as a slower reaction to kind of keep homeostasis. You can also have a one that acts pretty quickly, and that's designed more for a more immediate situation to get you amped up a little faster, so to speak. I keep saying amped up, but that's from a hormonal, not a necessarily, it's to get the response quicker, basically. All right, there are specific rates and rhythms of secretion of hormones, diurnal and cyclic, and there's just a lot that depends on that. But these are some general things about hormones. But another thing to remember about hormones is that they're only going to affect the target cells with the right receptors. This is a match. There has to be, you've all heard of diabetes before, and you've heard that, well, some people don't make insulin and some people are resistant to insulin. You have to have both. You have to have the supply, and then you have to have the receiver on the other end. And you could have a problem with either one of those things, okay? And so the receptors are found on the cells, and your cells will become resistant to it by kind of down-regulating those receptor sites. We'll talk more about that. But anyway, specific to the target cell. And they're handled by degradation through your kidneys and your liver and other cellular mechanisms. So we do break them down. They're made, don't use them, break them down. Bodies are great recyclers. All right, so hormones are released in a very regulated process, and they're responding to the cellular environment. And their goal is to maintain a regulated level of certain substances or other hormones. They are controlled in response and regulated by other chemical, hormonal, or neural factors. One hormone can signal another hormone. And again, we've talked about that negative feedback loop, which is sort of what is going on here with your thyroid system. So the thyroid is a great example of a negative feedback loop. And you could have a problem, if you look closely at this, you could have a problem in your hypothalamus, you could have a problem in your pituitary gland, and you could have a problem with your thyroid. So there's the hypothalamus is going to signal the pituitary, who's going to signal the thyroid. And then in response, the thyroid's going to do something. It's going to make hormone, or it's not going to make hormone. It has enough. And so then that message goes back to the hypothalamus in this case, and then signals more. So the interesting thing about this, when they measure whether or not somebody has hypo or hyperthyroid, that means, is my thyroid hyper? Is it making too much metabolic hormone that I need in all my cells, or is it making too little? If it's making too much, you will actually have a very low level of this thyroid stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary, because what happens is you're sending, this signal is going to tell the thyroid to keep working. If the thyroid is overproducing, the response back is going to be like, I don't need any more. And so the thyroid stimulating hormone value actually goes down, even though the thyroid is hyperactive. It's the opposite case in hypothyroid. When if your thyroid is not working real well, if it's not sending out thyroxine, the metabolic hormone that you need, it's not doing it, your TSH levels are going to be high, because your pituitary is like, okay, I need some of this, and the thyroid's like, I can't do it. So it keeps sending the pituitary gland, the anterior pituitary gland keeps sending thyroid stimulating hormone. It says, come on, come on, come on, come on. So that value is going to be up. So TSH is up when you have hypothyroidism, and it's down when your thyroid is hyperactive. So anyway, but that feedback, that kind of gives you a good example of how that feedback mechanism works. If everything's kept in balance, your thyroid stimulating hormone will say, it'll take feedback from the body and says, oh, I need some more thyroxine. I'm going to tell the thyroid to make it. It's going to make it. I'm going to get the feedback that it occurred. We have enough. And so the cycle is kind of always going back to normal. Or it could say, oh, we need a little less here, and then it won't send it. We'll just wait for feedback to send more. All right, structure of hormones is very important. We have some of these definitions of hormones get a little bit like not perfect, but in short, you've got amines and polypeptides and steroids. And so the big thing to look at are whether they're water soluble or not. And so your amines are groups that are derived from the amino acid tyrosine, and they're secreted from the thyroid and the adrenal medulla, however you want to say it. So the thyroxine, the hormone that I just talked about, not that stimulates the thyroid, but the one that the thyroid releases, is called thyroxine. That's the one it controls all your metabolism in your body. And so your cells need it. Every minute they need to be able to do metabolism. But those little boogers, the thyroid hormones, thyroxine, the ones that are delivered to the cell, are lipid soluble. Whereas other ones like the epinephrines and norepinephrines, the catecholamines, are water solubles. Now they're both made and derived from these amino acids of tyrosine, and they're secreted by the adrenals and the thyroid, but they're one's more lipid soluble and one's more water soluble, which I'll get to in a minute. You have some others that are polypeptides that are longer, amino acid sequences that are water soluble as well. Insulin and glucagon and growth hormone are examples of these that actually bind to the surface receptors on the cell membrane. And I'm going to talk about this. They involve secondary messengers, so hang on to that thought. But the steroid hormones that you are familiar with, they're made of lipids, cholesterol, and they are easily able to diffuse across the cell membrane. And testosterone, estrogen, corticoids, those are all primary signalers because they can get right into the cell easily. So I'm going to talk about that, and this is a very important topic. Hormone transport. Okay, so with hormones, you could have either problem making them or problem delivering them. And their chemical structure plays into the delivery part. And it's a little bit twisty-turny here, but hang with me. So a water-soluble hormone, no matter whether it's an amine or a polypeptide, if it's water-soluble, it will circulate freely in the blood in an unbound form. Remember, your blood is in serum is pretty liquidy. So the water-soluble hormones are just able to freely float due to their polar nature. They are typically fast responders, short-acting response, like very quick. They get there quickly because they don't need to be carried around. They're free-floating in there. These are the ones that will bind to those surface receptors that I've talked about, okay? And what they do is they actually need a secondary message to affect the cell. All right, so they're fast, they're floating around, they bind to surface receptors, but that does not trigger the release of a hormone or of an action. It has to get carried into the cell, and this is insulin and glucose action here that we're talking about. Going back to, you need that connection with the surface cell, is basically what I'm saying. It just won't go in. It has to kind of unlock a key and then get transported in with some other help. All right, lipid-soluble hormones are a little different. They can't, because they're not soluble in water, they don't circulate well in the blood. And so they have to be bound to a carrier, a protein, to help make them be carried in the blood on something that is more like water soluble, and so that it can move around. There's a difference is that they have a pretty quick response, but they're a long-lasting response. They take a little bit longer to get there, okay? But they can last a little bit longer because of that. Anyway, what happens with lipid-soluble hormones is that they circulate bound to a carrier, and then they have a hard time getting transport, but once they're there, they're first in the cell because of their solubility with the cell membrane and the lipids, they can diffuse right across the plasma membrane and get right into signaling the cell to do something. All right. So trying to summarize that, and it's really an important concept. So because it goes to insulin resistance and things like that. And, but anyway, if you have a lipid soluble hormone, it's going to have a harder time transporting in the blood because of its solubility. It's not soluble in water, so it's got to attach to the protein that makes it soluble. But once it gets to the cell, it'll start signal transduction, and the cascading effect immediately goes right through. Second messenger molecules are what we call the water solubles. They will easily transmit through the blood, but once they get to the cell, they only can bind to the receptor. They can't go into the cell and initiate a reaction. But that binding does, and then there's a second messenger inside the cell that actually carries out the goal of that hormone. So this is kind of an example. If you really wanted to understand, all this that I've just been saying, you would look at this picture and it would make sense to you. If I hid this, that it's a steroid hormone, hopefully you would see this, that one, it's using a carrier protein in the blood because of the polarity. It's not soluble in water, and so it needs this carrier protein to help it be carried around. When it sees the target cells, it just diffuses right across, and it receives, there's probably a receptor protein, and whether or not it's going to get inside the nucleus to create a protein or whatever, in this case, the response is to get into, the action is to get into the cell and do some translation and transcribing and translation of a protein. That's the actual response that I want to get for this hormone. Opposite of that is water-soluble hormones that float around freely in the blood easily because they're soluble in water, but when they get out and they see that target cell, they can only just bind here. They don't get in right away. They bind, but that binding triggers something else, the second message, to actually activate an enzyme or get the action that hormone is supposed to do. And so this is called secondary, it's a secondary messaging system, because their initial thing is important, but it doesn't carry out the function of the desired effect. And so insulin and glucose is a good example of this. When insulin attaches, it does signal this cascading effect to actually bring up what's called a glucose transport molecule up to the surface to pull that glucose in. It just doesn't let it in automatically. All right, that's a brief summary of hormones and their structure and their function. Thank you.